you begin to teach, very shortly after that, you begin to think about what you need to do in order to assess or to test your students. And as soon as you have them doing any kind of writing or any kind of speaking, you need to think about how you're going to grade that in a consistent way across multiple students. And at that point, you probably need to start thinking about what kind of rubric to use and how to create a rubric. And that is what I want to speak to you about now. You may have a fairly good idea about what a rubric is. Generally, we're exposed to them in our teacher training, and you can see an example of a holistic kind of rubric. It looks like a table with a score down the first column and then descriptors of criteria in the main body of the table. And this is an example then of a holistic rubric, but there's other types of rubrics, and you may want to use a different type of rubric for a different type of test task. So we want to get to the point where you can match the test task with the type of rubric that you need to use. When do we use rubrics? You'll want to use a rubric anytime you have an extended response from a student in speaking or in writing that requires a subjective evaluation. As teachers, we often really like to use rubrics for a variety of reasons. One is when we're looking at extended responses made by our students, it's actually very practical to have a rubric. It makes your scoring a little bit easier. It ensures that your scoring is consistent, or we could say reliable, across multiple students. It does provide some type of feedback to students, usually because students are able to look at the descriptors of their proficiency level and get an idea of their strengths and weaknesses. And so it enhances, it's a way to provide accountability to our students, because we're really providing them with as much feedback as we can. So teachers generally like to use rubrics. Often, though, teachers have a love-hate relationship with their rubrics. They like to use rubrics, but perhaps not this one, or they can find problems with a particular rubric. And so when you start to develop or thinking about using your own rubric, don't think ever that your rubric is absolutely completely finished. You may want to tweak it as you go along after each use to make it and improve it, make it a little bit better and better. But generally, teachers really like rubrics. What about students? Do you think students like rubrics? The answer to that question is usually yes. Students do like rubrics, again, because they can see the criteria for their success. They can see their strengths and their weaknesses. They usually provide quite a bit of feedback to students. Often students are more engaged when they know the criteria upon which you're basing your evaluations, and it can be motivational for students. And it can, if they have worked with a rubric, you've been using the rubric before and they're familiar with it, it can provide them with a real sense of stability across multiple assignments. So yeah, usually students like rubrics too. There are different types of rubrics that teachers frequently use when they evaluate student speaking or writing. And I'm going to mention three of them now. One is a primary trait rubric, the other is a holistic rubric, and the last one is an analytic rubric. And each of these types of rubrics have their own strengths and weaknesses that you should be aware of. A primary trait rubric is a rubric that just evaluates a single trait on a piece of writing or speaking. So it is the rubric that's probably the least commonly used, and you'll be able to see why as I get into my explanation. So let's say you have asked students to write a persuasive essay, and you decide that the main characteristic, the prime characteristic that you want to evaluate in that assignment is the persuasive ability of that particular student. And so you would provide a single score that is dependent upon whether that student managed to persuade you of their point of view or not. So you can see a primary trait rubric then refers to evaluation of a single trait that you have determined to be the most important for that particular thing, for that particular assignment. And usually it's a fairly simple scale of 0 to 3. Either you were not persuaded, or you were sort of persuaded, or you were definitely persuaded. I guess that would be a scale of 0 to 2. So it's quite a simple rubric. And you can see that that type of rubric would have some challenges with it, in the sense that it doesn't provide students with a lot of feedback, and it doesn't recognize that while an essay might be quite persuasive, it may actually be weak in terms of its grammatical accuracy or its vocabulary range or even its organization. And so, although we mention primary trait rubrics because people do use them, usually they're not used very frequently. So we'll move on to talking about the other two types of rubrics now. You can see on the screen an example of a holistic rubric that would be used to score student writing. You can see in the first column there's a series of grades that range from A to E. And in the main table are the descriptors that describe proficiency levels at each of those grade levels. If you take a look at the top row next to the score of A, or the grade of A, you can see that the descriptors include excellence in content, as well as organization, vocabulary range, as well as spelling and punctuation, and there's even a comment about coherence in there. So that's a lot of information to contain in a single description of proficiency. And you can see that this perhaps leads to the weakness of this particular rubric. There are advantages to holistic rubrics, and you may be able to guess that one of the advantages is that they're quite fast to use. In terms of the scoring that you can accomplish with them is fairly speedy. So, and as you get more practice with using these types of holistic rubrics, you get to have a very good feel about what a piece of student writing looks like at each grade, and you can place students quite quickly in a grade level, A, B, C, D, or E, and you can move relatively quickly through your student writing. So they are fast. They are fairly reliable in that they allow you consistency in marking across multiple students, and these are really good reasons to use holistic rubrics. The other benefit of holistic rubrics is that they yield a single score. This is very useful actually if you are going to give that score to an administrator. Really, an administrator really wants a single score. That's all they want. Just tell me how good that student is so that I can place them, or that I can tell, either admit them or not admit them. And so there's always a push from the administrator to have a single score that is easy to interpret, and holistic rubrics generate that. You can see that based on their descriptors, the student will have a single score, and so you might use a holistic rubric for that purpose. The other thing about holistic rubrics is that although most rubrics are challenging to create, a holistic rubric is perhaps a little bit easier to create than an analytic rubric. So if you're thinking of developing your own rubric, then a holistic rubric might be a good way to start. Wherever possible, it's much easier to work with a rubric that perhaps some of your colleagues have generated, or that has been generated through research. So use those if you can. And if not, feel free to generate your own, but just accept the fact that it may take a little while. And again, a holistic rubric may be a little bit easier to start with than an analytic rubric. Holistic rubrics are also very useful for situations where you need to score a lot of tests or exams fast. So often those involve placement tests or final exams where you may have large numbers of students completing an assessment or a test all together, and you need to process their work quite quickly. In those situations, holistic rubrics are good choices. Just as there are advantages with holistic rubrics, there are also disadvantages. And you may have guessed by looking at that example of a holistic rubric that one of the challenges with them is that they collapse a lot of criteria into a single grade. So what happens if you have a student who's got really strong content but quite poor organization? It's hard then to assess them accurately with simply a holistic rubric, because the holistic descriptors group all of those things into a single unified score. So sometimes you might find with your holistic rubric that you have two students who are really quite different in abilities. One has strong content and weak organization, and the other has really good grammatical accuracy but poor content, and they may end up with a similar grade. And so the holistic rubric is less able to reflect the differences between those students because of the way it's constructed. Holistic rubrics also don't provide a lot of feedback to your students in terms of their strengths and their weaknesses. Again, if you think of that student who's got really strong grammatical accuracy and really weak content, they're not going to be able to see that from the holistic rubric. So that's a really important weakness. If you're scoring a test that requires multiple scorers or multiple markers, you may also find that it's quite difficult to get everybody marking in the same way using a holistic rubric. It's a bit of a challenge to ensure consistency across markers, and so that's a real shortcoming for holistic rubrics as well. Let's have a look at analytic rubrics then. On the screen you can see an example of an analytic rubric. You can see the example there. It's a table that's actually empty. Analytic rubrics, once the content is filled in the table, the descriptors are added in, analytic rubrics can often be quite long, and so it's challenging to get everything on one screen. But you can see the outline for it here. Like a holistic rubric, analytic rubrics have the grade score, the grade scale in the first column. And so you can see that here. Across the top, though, they have multiple columns, and each column has a subskill that broken out, and then descriptors for each subskill. So you can see for writing, you might have a column for content, one for organization, one for grammar or form or accuracy, another for vocabulary, or any other subskill that you decide is important to assess in your context. And although we were able to add descriptors in this particular example because it would have made it too long, the middle part of the table usually contains descriptors of each of the subskills at each of the proficiency levels. Just like holistic rubrics, analytic rubrics have advantages and disadvantages. So let's talk about the advantages first. One of the most important advantages of an analytic rubric is that it provides very specific feedback to students, so they can clearly see whether they have strengths in content or weaknesses in organization, strengths in vocabulary range, or weaknesses in spelling or punctuation. And this is really important feedback for students to get. So in that sense, it's very helpful to the student. The other thing a teacher can do with an analytic rubric is, because the subskills are broken out, the teacher can actually weight the subskills according to how important they think those are. And this is an option that's not available to you when you use a holistic rubric. So for example, let's say you're teaching a grammar course where you ask students to write quite a bit. In their assessment of their writing, you may use a rubric, but it would be completely understandable if you weighted the grammar component of that particular task more heavily than content and organization, because that would match very closely with what you had been teaching students. That would make sense. Conversely, if you had an essay writing kind of course where you were focusing mostly on different rhetorical patterns, you might choose to emphasize content and organization and de-emphasize the grammar or accuracy part. You may not, but you have that option when you're a teacher using an analytic rubric. Another advantage of an analytic rubric is that it produces more reliable scores than a holistic one, particularly across multiple scorers, but also possibly just for your own scoring purposes. Because you're assessing each subskill individually, you're able to make a judgment on one particular subskill before you move on to the next particular subskill. So you can evaluate content separately from organization, separately from accuracy. Another advantage of analytic rubrics is that if, for an example, you're using them for research purposes, The analytic rubric then gives a really good picture to the researcher of the strengths and weaknesses of your student. That's sort of an unusual circumstance, but if you are involved in a research project, it's a good idea probably to use an analytic rubric. Of course, there are disadvantages to analytic rubrics as well, and one of the bigger disadvantages is that it takes a longer time to score. Because you're weighing each, or you're judging each sub-skill separately, it may take you a little bit more time than it does if you were using a holistic rubric. You may also find that analytic rubrics are harder to develop. If you have to build an analytic rubric yourself, it's probably a little bit more challenging because you have to write more descriptors for analytic rubrics than for a holistic rubric. And when you're writing those descriptors, you may have a challenging time avoiding overlap between one descriptor and another, and ambiguity. So that's always a challenge when you're creating an analytic rubric. Another challenge with an analytic rubric is that it may not allow you to assess the overall effect of a text. And by this I mean that you may actually have a student who produces a writing text that is fairly weak in terms of grammar. The accuracy is quite poor, they're making lots of mistakes. And yet overall, boy, you really appreciate what they've done. They've created a text that's creative, that's really interesting. It may not have superior content, but perhaps somehow it's very appealing due to its rhythmic quality or almost poetic license perhaps that the student has used. And so if you are very analytic with the rubric, if you have an analytic rubric and you become very analytic when you look at pieces of writing like that, you may not actually be able to capture the overall effect with an analytic rubric. So when it comes time for you to create a rubric, you probably want to choose between a holistic rubric and an analytic rubric. Perhaps your ultimate choice will be determined by reasons of practicality and the reason for your assessment. So if you've got a lot of tests to score, you're probably going to choose a holistic type of rubric. If you have fewer scores to do, fewer students to score, and you're really interested in getting good feedback to those students, you may choose an analytic rubric. Alright, so let's look at the framework that we looked at before when we were talking about analytic rubrics. And for each area of the rubric, you need to make decisions. And your decisions really reflect your philosophy or your approach to teaching and learning a second language. So keep that in mind whenever you're developing a rubric, that your decisions then reflect your values. So they're not value neutral, and that's important to remember. Alright, so your first decision then when you create a rubric is to decide on your scoring scale. Do you want a lot of divisions or just a smaller number of divisions? Do you want to run from 0 to 4 or 1 to 6 or 0 to 9 or 10? Research shows that if you have quite a few divisions, it gets quite difficult to write distinctive descriptors for each subskill. So oftentimes it's better to keep the scoring range a little bit lower. So let's say you may want to go 0 to 6. Where you start the scoring scale is important. Perhaps you started at 0, and that would be a grade that you would assign to students who have 0 production. But perhaps you want to recognize that students who even put a few words down, even if they don't get to write an essay or a structured essay, even students who put a few words down are deserving of at least 1 mark. In that case, if that's your philosophy, then you would start your scale at 1. And the number of divisions that you have then really reflect how clearly you can write distinctive descriptors for each level. To create an analytic rubric, your next decision relates to the subskills that you're going to evaluate, and you're going to write those across the top of the columns. So you've got to decide what you're going to evaluate. Generally, if you're evaluating writing, you're going to have a column for content, one for organization, and one for grammar, accuracy, or form. But there are lots of other different sub-skills that people may find pertinent to their teaching contexts. So for example, if you've been really encouraging your students to watch their spelling and check their spelling, then you may want to add a separate column for spelling. That might be quite important to you and to what you're trying to teach your students. Or you may really want to emphasize vocabulary range. You've really been building your students' vocabulary and you want to see them applying that in their written work. So it may be really useful for you to have another column there where you attempt to assess their vocabulary range. So whatever you pick to go across the headings of those columns that reflect the sub-skills, that's your choice, and it reflects your values, what you value in writing proficiency or in speaking proficiency in your students. When developing a rubric, you'll also need to spend quite a bit of time developing the descriptors that go in the middle of the table. So you want to write distinctive descriptors at each grade level for each sub-skill. And that can be really challenging, but it's really, really important. One good idea when you're developing an analytic rubric is to draft one and, if you can, pilot test it, either with some old assignments that you might still have around that you've kept, or you may ask some of your colleagues to have a look at it and make suggestions, or you may even run it as a test with some of your students and ask them if they could work with this rubric or make suggestions or have them try and do a peer assessment with it. It's good to try and get feedback on an analytic rubric before you actually use it for a higher stakes situation. It's difficult to develop an analytic rubric, and you may find that as you go along and you use it assignment after assignment, you may want to change it and update it. So I always think for my own rubrics that they're never really in a finished state. I'm always trying to push them to be a little bit more accurate in their descriptors, a little bit to reflect a little bit better the skills that I want my students to learn. One thing that you may find really useful when you're developing rubrics, either holistic or analytic rubrics, is a rubric website. There are some really good websites on the internet that help create rubrics. And you can go to one of these. Most of them are free. Generally, they require you to sign on with your email and to create an account, but then you don't need to pay for them. And you can, if you want, select from a group of predetermined sub-skills, or you can create your own sub-skills. You can then select from pre-written descriptors, or you can write your own descriptors. There's a fair amount of flexibility in how these rubric websites work, so you may find that they're really useful, particularly if you're in that situation, very common to many teachers. It's the night before and you wanted to hand back students' assignments the next day and you really don't have a rubric that you're comfortable with in terms of assessing the writing. Rubric websites are not a bad place to start. Again, you may not want to finish there or just leave it at that, but they're really a pretty good place to start to develop a rubric quickly. To conclude then, when you are testing, anytime you have an extended student response in either speaking or in writing, you're going to want to use a rubric. And you probably want to choose between holistic or analytic rubrics, although you might consider primary trait for those situations where you want a really fast mark, really speedy. But you're probably going to pick between a holistic and an analytic rubric. And just remember as you're developing your rubrics that all of your decisions, the grading scale and the sub-skills that you choose to evaluate and how you write out your descriptors, they all reflect what you value in student proficiency.